9 months after the amuse-bouche that was Mega Man 7, Capcom would service the main course of Mega Man X3 just in time for Christmas.
As is tradition.
The story this time is that a Reploid scientist named Dr. Doppler has isolated the Sigma virus and created a cure, effectively preventing any future Reploid rebellions, and in a further act of philanthropy, also founded Doppeltown as a refuge for the reformed rebels. Cool, our work is done here, roll credits. Of course, it can never be that easy, and it's revealed that the entire thing was a farce, with Dr. Doppler himself inciting another Reploid coup using his city as a barracks, aided by his most powerful Reploid assistants, Bit and Byte, as well as a rebuilt version of Vile. The intro stage once again eases us into the standard gameplay, but it also introduces one major new addition. You now can play as Zero by switching characters via the pause menu. Zero comes equipped with the dash and his own version of the charge shot, as well as his signature beam saber. And as the game continues, you'll come to discover there's actually a lot more going on this time in terms of player choice. X has more upgrades, there's 4 different unlockable ride armors, alternate endings, the fights with Bit, Byte, and Vile, and they even bring back a bit of the interconnected stage elements from X1. Playing Blast Hornet stage before Gravity Beetles will allow you to intercept a cargo shipment, opening up sections of Beetles stage that would normally be blocked off by crates. And this will also replace a certain semi-common enemy type with a weaker variant throughout the rest of the game. Blast Hornet stage also hosts the first of several ride armor variants, and finding the different model types in certain hidden areas will allow you to summon one from these platforms. These protect X from damage and offer powerful attacks, usually either a punch or missiles. And the Frog and Hawk models allow you to stride underwater or hover mid-air respectively. The ride armors also lead to various other hidden power-ups, as the mechs are capable of breaking through certain barricades that none of X's weapons are able to. As always, there's the 8 different special weapons gained from defeating each of the game's main bosses, and this time they're all mostly decent. Frost Shield only acts as an actual shield when it's charged up, otherwise it's a sort of mine and becomes more effective underwater, and killing specific enemy types with it will also guarantee they drop health recoveries. It's just too bad that the game never tells you this, and so I never took advantage of it. Acid Burst is like the inverse to that, as it becomes next to useless underwater and will make certain enemies drop weapon ammo. Tornado Fang is neither tornado nor fang, but instead a drill that can be fired either one at a time or in a spread, which is great for dealing consecutive hits to large or slow-moving enemies, as well as breaking through cracked walls. Gravity Well is, unfortunately, a gravity weapon, meaning it's useful against small airborne enemies and the one boss that's weak to it, and literally nowhere else. I mean, except for raising this one specific platform, I guess. Triad Thunder is the closest this game has to the barrier-type special weapon, and so I used it quite a bit. Its charged version causes quakes, which can also knock loose certain bits of scenery. The weapon is obtained from Volt Catfish, which is a reference to the mythological Japanese Namazu, a catfish that could cause earthquakes. This is also why A Link to the Past's Quake Medallion was obtained from a catfish, and where the Pokemon Whiscash came from. Spinning Blade fires 2, spinning blades that then spread out and behind X, so they're great for quickly taking out enemies directly in front of you or for covering your flank if aimed well. Meanwhile, the charged version is a giant saw blade yo-yo. Parasitic Bomb was the only one I never found a real use for. Its charged version locks onto all on-screen enemies, but that takes a few seconds, and its base version can, I guess, pull 2 enemies together. This really seems like a gimmick weapon. I didn't even really need to use it against the Maverick who's actually weak to it. Honestly, a lot of the weapon's most useful features show up in their charged forms, which only become available once you receive the Buster upgrade. But in Mega Man X3, the Buster upgrade in particular is a very mixed bag. Allowing you to charge your special weapons is a legitimate plus, but the double shot granted by the upgrade in X2 has been reworked into this sluggish combo shot that never seems to actually hit its target in time. In my research, I've noticed that it isn't uncommon for a lot of fans to just skip the Buster upgrade entirely, unless they're absolutely determined to get everything. Luckily, the other upgrades are just fine. The leg armor upgrade again grants a mid-air dash, but this time this also means dashing straight upwards, which gives the function a lot more general utility than it had in X2, where the standard dash jump rendered it somewhat redundant. The body armor upgrade no longer grants you a new weapon, but instead returns to its X1 role of halving the damage X takes, and this time it also erects a barrier for a few seconds after taking a hit, reducing damage even further. The helmet upgrade is strictly utilitarian. Upon entering a level, it will display a map of any heart tanks, sub-tanks, ride armors, or armor upgrades still remaining in the stage, as well as listing the obtained and unobtained items on the level select screen. But in addition to these, there are also new enhancement chips that X can pick up from special capsules that will further enhance one of the 4 body parts. The leg chip allows for 2 consecutive air dashes, the body chip grants even more defense, meaning damage is now cut down to 1/4, the helmet chip will now slowly recover your health and even your sub-tanks if you stand completely still, and the arm chip is what grants you your secret 9th special weapon, the Hypercharge, which allows you to fire fully powered X-Buster shots with no charge time, but operates on limited ammo and needs time to refill before it can be used again. The caveat with these chips, though, is that they can only be installed one at a time. But if you choose to ignore all 4, you have the opportunity to collect the secret Hyper Armor instead, which effectively acts as all 4 chips at once. There's also Bit, Bite, and Vile, which act as this game's stand-in for X2's X-Hunters. Bit and Bite's fights will take place in one of the standard Maverick stages once you clear any 2, while Vile will have to be tracked down in a hidden area within specific stages. They can be defeated with any weapon, but these fights will have different outcomes depending on if you defeat them with their weaknesses or not. If you do, they'll be dead for good, and their rematch fights in the game's final gauntlet will be swapped out with more generic bosses. This can also affect your chance to acquire X3's version of the Hadoken, Zero's Beam Saber. If you defeat and kill Vile with his weakness before reaching the final gauntlet of stages, and then switch to play as Zero before reaching this boss room, Zero will be Yamcha'd upon inflicting the killing blow, and as he leaves to Dr. Kane's lab for emergency repairs, he'll grant X his Beam Saber. X can swing the blade and fire its corresponding beam whenever his buster is fully charged, and the Beam Saber is capable of killing any boss in the game in 2 shots. Although, in Doppler's case, be sure not to use it when he has his weapon-absorbing shield up. It will allow him to recover crazy amounts of health. Honestly, the amount of content and player choice in this game is pretty impressive, and also nice to see after X2's contributions were comparatively so few. Despite this, though, I feel like a lot of these new additions were vastly underutilized or just poorly implemented. The ride armors are only available in select portions of certain levels, and are really only used to access other better upgrades. The downright awful Buster upgrade leaves the player's only options as either being stuck with an inferior charge shot, or not being able to use their charged special weapons at all. Getting completely locked out of the Hyper Armor if you pick up even one of the enhancement chips also feels like almost vindictive game design. Sure, Dr. Lightogram warns you that you can only install 1 chip at a time, but he doesn't warn you that the most powerful upgrade in the game will be unobtainable if you do. It also isn't preserved with passwords, even though the Beam Saber obtained after that point is, and not to mention, its all-gold color scheme is just criminally tacky. Bit and Bite are also integrated into the gameplay a lot less gracefully than the X-Hunters were in the last game. You can no longer choose to avoid or confront them of your own accord, nor can you avoid the rooms in which they show up. Bit will always show up in either your 3rd, 4th, or 5th stage, where Bite will always show up in your 6th, 7th, or 8th. And since you're unable to choose when and where these guys show up, it also means the order you choose to achieve the special weapons will also affect whether you're able to permanently kill them or not, which will in turn affect later bosses and story events. Vile you can at least avoid until you're ready for him, and for me, the rematch with Bit and Bite if you don't kill them is actually easier than the alternative you fight if you do, but trapping the player in a situation like that when the last game gave you a lot more agency in the matter feels like a downgrade. And probably most tragic of all is Zero's inclusion. Playing as Zero is something I feel like a lot of fans would have been really excited about back then, but there are very few instances in the game where you would need or even want to do so. You can only tag him in once per stage, and you'll be forced to switch back to X anytime you want to enter a boss door anyway, so his utility is very limited. Zero's presence makes virtually no difference on the game's overall flow, and in fact, Zero is usually the worst choice when compared to X. Sure, he has a maxed out health gauge by default, and the Beam Saber is crazy powerful, but he can't collect or use any of X's upgrades or special weapons, meaning he becomes less helpful the further into the game you get. And perhaps most damning, he also only has 1 life, meaning if you die as Zero even a single time, he'll be gone for the rest of the game. By the time you're ready for the final gauntlet, switching to Zero becomes more a detriment than a bonus. And honestly, the only real reason to do so is so that X can get the Beam Saber, something that's only possible if you were savvy enough to kill Vile permanently beforehand. Probably the first thing I really noticed about X3's gameplay is that its difficulty curve is horrendous. The first stage I played was Blizzard Buffaloes, which, as you might expect, is an ice-themed level. And there was a certain point where I needed to backtrack to retry a jump I had missed that would allow me to grab an upgrade. But I was constantly struggling with this slight incline that has insanely slippery ice physics flinging me off screen. This, combined with the usual Mega Man respawning enemies, resulted in me sometimes having to defeat the same enemy 4 or 5 times in a row before I could properly backtrack. And enemies throughout the whole game also seem to be a lot more defensive and gimmicky in general. Like these crabs that fire bigger shots if you're charging your weapon, or these tanks that fire drills that block all your weapons. Even comparatively weak enemies can end up being a huge nuisance. The standout example to me being these turrets that lean flush to the ground if they see you or you fire so much as a pellet at them. Keep in mind, you can't crouch or aim low in Mega Man games, and here you have a basic enemy whose first response to your presence is to duck. Now, having just played Vector Man with its smooth 8-directional aiming and built-in crouching, I won't lie, it was a little clumsy going back to a Mega Man X game, where the standard moveset only allows for firing in one direction and no crouching. I get that the charge shot and the special weapons are meant to make up for those shortcomings, but it's also just kind of funny to think that this super advanced fighting robot from the 22nd century, built to be capable of real human thought and emotion, is apparently completely incapable of bending his knees. And these were far from the only annoying adversaries in this game. I could bring up several more, like the Head Gunner, the Victoroid, or the Caterkiller, shout out Sonic. But to keep it short, a lot of the enemies in Mega Man X3 require more time to stop and kill unless you want to just avoid them completely. And I feel like this was a decision made largely to help mitigate this game's somewhat straightforward level layouts. While stages will occasionally have sections where paths diverge, there's always a middle portion where they meet up again, and that's because they needed to make sure you always pass through those bit and bite encounter rooms. And having every level feel very cleanly split into 2 halves like this results in them all feeling somewhat samey despite each one's unique backgrounds and theming. 3 of the game's bosses are water-themed, a crawfish, a catfish, and a seahorse, and yet there's only a single room in the basic 8 stages that features an underwater segment. The hallways and rooms also range from being chock full of enemies at every turn, or completely devoid of them, with no in-between. And in at least one instance, a screen transition will send you into a spiked floor without warning. Better hope you have the air dash upgrade. The most clever or interesting bit of level design was this one bit in Crush Crawfish's stage, where destroying the submersible's engine causes the level to flip on its side as it starts to sink. Other than that, though, the only real notable stage gimmicks are found in the form of slow-moving elevators, most of which you can just wall jump to bypass anyway. The worst offender in this case, though, is the stupid snail wall in the second Dr. Doppler stage, where you're forced to ride these slow-moving snail bots up a shaft lined with insta-death spikes. One of the snails is even a fake-out that leads to a dead end, and any fall or bad jump will result in you basically having to start completely over, assuming you don't accidentally hit the spikes and die. And for the record, 1-ups were a lot scarcer in this game. I only found 2 in the standard Maverick levels, and I only saw an enemy drop one once. The most reliable source of them comes during the final gauntlet, in the room where you have the Maverick rematches. If you have the Beam Saber, using it on this pillar in between each fight will grant you an extra life each time, but by then the game is basically over. Also, and I fully admit that this was mostly a personal problem on my end, this was the game where Mega Man X's controls really started to wear down on me. I don't know, maybe I'm just getting old and my hand-eye coordination isn't what it used to be, but whenever I found myself overwhelmed, surrounded by enemies, or dodging boss attacks, I would often hit the completely wrong button, firing when I meant to jump or vice versa. I always switched the dash to one of the shoulder buttons. That way I can dash, jump, and shoot simultaneously without straining my fingers. But in the heat of a battle, it can often be hard to juggle wall jumps, mid-air dashes, charge shots, and directional inputs all at the same time without flubbing something up. I tried changing the controller layout several times, but I was never able to find one that truly felt ideal. Which was odd because I didn't have this problem with X1 or 2, and the controls are the exact same here, so what gives? Again, I think this might be due to having just played Vector Man, a game that I felt had much more intuitive aiming and shooting controls, but also it felt like X3 put me in high-stress situations a lot more often than the prior two, which is bound to result in some minor panicking every now and then. The sheer number of upgrades and hidden secrets in X3 of course means there will be a lot more backtracking, but they somehow managed to make this feel lopsided. In my playthrough, I decided to do Blizzard Buffalo first and then just go in boss weakness order, which is the most often recommended stage order, I will note. But doing the stages in this order meant that most of the heart and sub-tanks, ride armors, and upgrades were completely out of my reach for most of my first playthrough. You need the ride armors to get to a lot of them, and you can't access any ride armors until you find the one in Blast Hornet stage. And if I do Buffalo stage first and go in weakness order, that unfortunately means Blast Hornet comes last. This not only resulted in me playing through the majority of the game with less maximum health and only the leg upgrade, it also meant I spent a good 45 minutes before the Doppler stages doing nothing but replaying old stages to finally get everything I missed. My main criticism for X2 was a lack of new content or game mechanics, and boy did that monkey's paw curl with this one. The ride armors in particular threw a huge wrench into my playthrough since the stage that unlocks them, and thus unlocks most of the other secrets in the game, happened to be the one that made most sense for me to do last. It's a problem that I did not encounter in the first two X games. My path through those games didn't have any substantial effect on backtracking since I usually had a way to find something in each stage the first time through. But here, if you want everything, you'll either have to devote a lot of time to replaying stages, or defeat a lot of bosses without their weakness on hand. Further highlighting the game's lopsided difficulty is that the game's bosses also aren't overly interesting nor difficult. Some even come off as lazy. Neon Tiger is essentially just Slash Man again, and the fights with Bit, Bite, and Vile, even if you lack their weaknesses, have routines that are very easy to memorize and exploit. And there are at least 3 bosses in this game that ram into walls as a primary method of attack, including this mini-boss in Tunnel Rhino stage that lasts way too long. And a thing they started doing with the later Mega Man games, and especially the Mega Man X games, is that in addition to boss weaknesses dealing more damage, they also completely cripple their AI, and that's dialed up to 11 here. Blast Hornet, Toxic Seahorse, and Gravity Beetle can all easily be defeated without taking a single hit just by casually firing the right weapon. God, especially Gravity Beetle. Poor Gravity Beetle.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Blizzard Buffalo is also a complete joke due to a bizarre bug in his AI. He rams into walls, shocker, but for whatever reason, if you do a mid-air dash right as he turns around, it'll, short out his eye circuits or something, and he'll immediately turn around and ram into the same wall again. So get into the right rhythm and you won't take a single hit. And considering the air dash upgrade is available in his stage and can be acquired first thing no matter what, you don't ever actually need to use this guy's weakness to defeat him. The music, surprisingly, also feels uncharacteristically bland for a Mega Man game. All things considered, even if I end up not caring for a particular Mega Man title, I can at least count on the game having some pretty good tunes. But to my surprise and disappointment, not much stuck out to me here. It's all a bit more subdued and grungy than the usually high-octane rock and metal of the other games. And nothing against grunge, but I'm just not sure it all really works in this context. A bad stage can be at least somewhat salvaged with some good music, but that never really happened here. Tunnel Rhino is a dull stage with dull boss fights, and sadly his music is just as dull. Blast Hornet's stage theme was one I thought was legitimately good, but as I mentioned, that was the last stage I played, and by then it seemed like too little too late. And looking up this game's composer reveals that she is definitely capable of some really inspired stuff. Kinuyo Yamashita was one of the composers for the original Castlevania, and wrote a handful of truly iconic tracks there, so it's a shame that she didn't really seem to be on her A-game here. My co-writer points out to me, though, that Neon Tiger's theme sounds a lot like this song by Guns N' Roses. And that's kind of funny foreshadowing for future Mega Man X games that pay homage to the band. And even beyond just the music, the game's sound design seems weirdly muted. Doors open and close completely noiselessly, and most sound effects are barely audible, all while the music blares away at 110% at all times. The team also apparently couldn't be bothered to make sure the end credits music was actually long enough to last for the entire sequence. It doesn't even seamlessly loop either, it just completely stops and starts over from the beginning. And it does that at least 3 times. And all these weird little details, the way this game feels so off compared to the last two, started making a lot more sense to me once I learned that this one was actually outsourced to a third-party dev team. Minakuchi Engineering, the team responsible for all the Game Boy Mega Mans except for 2, led the charge on this one, and apparently Keiji Inafune being told to entrust his baby to a team of quote-unquote outsiders was something he took quite a bit of issue with. especially since his team had just been rushed into making Mega Man 7 instead on a ridiculous 3-month deadline. Over the years of his work on the franchise, Inafune had been gradually promoted from his initial role of art and character design to more managerial roles like producing and directing. While he was given control of the stories of the Mega Man X games, he found his supervisory jobs to be far less fulfilling, much less having to completely hand everything over to another team entirely. Going completely hands-off for the third X game was not something he was prepared for. This would also happen to be the last game ever made by Minakuchi Engineering, and yeah, I guess that checks out. If Mega Man X2 seemed like a slight decline compared to X1, then Mega Man X3 feels much more like a sheer drop. There is something here. Clearly the team was trying their best to implement new and interesting mechanics into the formula, especially with the addition of a playable Zero and branching storylines. Knowing that this one was made by an outside B team, though, you definitely start to see the seams. While it isn't abysmal as a sequel, all things considered, this definitely should not be someone's first exposure to Mega Man X. It feels way more unfair and unforgiving than the first two titles. In fact, in terms of difficulty and level design, this is the most genuinely frustrated I've ever been with a Mega Man game since the Boo Beam Trap from Mega Man 2. Sure, my Mega Man 5 review almost made me give up on the series, but that was more due to franchise fatigue than any actual fault with the game itself. Here, I got angry, and the only reprieve from the frustration, ironically, was the game's dumb-as-rocks bosses. I can't imagine die-hard Mega Man fans seeing this game as an ideal 16-bit send-off. And I feel like if Capcom had just axed Mega Man 7 and instead had the team really hone in on the third X title, things could have turned out for the better. Instead of 2 half-baked Mega Man titles, we might have gotten 1 excellent one. Even still, much like the Sigma virus, Mega Man would persist throughout the mid to late 90s. And this is far from the worst it would get.